My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. And I'm here with our publications editor, Alistair Somerville. In October, we published a report on information operations entitled The New Weapon of Choice, Technology and Information Operations Today. The report examined the problem of misinformation and disinformation and the targeting of democratic societies by malign actors through information operations. We spoke about the report a few weeks ago on this podcast with Nina Jankowicz from the Wilson Center. Our report analyzes the problem and provides recommendations for a path forward to deal with the threats posed by the spread of false narratives, especially those on social media platforms. On December 1st, we hosted an event with the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to discuss solutions to this problem that take a whole-of-society approach. Are citizens prepared to tackle disinformation in a digital age? What role do education and media literacy play in getting to the heart of this problem and enabling a whole-of-society approach? It is clear that alongside governments and technology companies, civil society and educational organizations play a significant role in mitigating misinformation and disinformation.
We discussed that and more at the event, and you can find a link to the event video as well as a link to our report in our show notes. But Kelly, tell us, what were your main takeaways from the event?
So for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that while each country, situation, group, or society, whatever, is unique in its own way, there's still transferable critical thinking skills and digital literacy tools that we can teach people, both old and young. I was also heartened to hear that it sounds like nations that have had success in educating and sensitizing their publics to these issues, such as Finland, which gets tossed around quite a bit, and you'll hear us talk a little bit about that if you watch the video of the event, have been working to partner with like-minded nations to share best practices and combat information operations. While Finland is obviously a unique country in many ways, there are still things that can be transferred, and coordination between Finland and other countries in the Baltics or even in the EU in a larger sense, and even the United States, it really is important that these countries coordinate. Ultimately, though, there will also still need to be some sort of regulation of social media platforms, either self-imposed or imposed by the government.
Yeah, and I think one of the main takeaways on my side, you mentioned giving people tools to combat this problem themselves. Mike Caulfield, one of our panelists who's a professor, had an acronym that he uses, SIFT, that's Stop, Investigate, Find, and Trace. When you're confronted with new information, you really need to stop and think about what it is that you're reading, that you're seeing, that you're watching in a video, figure out where is this information actually coming from, find some reliable source material to look at, to educate yourself. And I think those kinds of acronyms, those kinds of tools are a really good way to start educating children in schools, but also people of all ages on how to actually deal with this problem that all of us are confronted with, even if we don't realize it on a day-to-day basis, and how to actually get to the heart of the disinformation problem. And we've also been partnering with the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations to host the Sphere of Influence, which is our monthly convening of individuals, groups, organizations across different sectors working on influence operations, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, those kind of topics, and linking up folks to brainstorm and see what others are working on was a key recommendation in our working group report. And we're excited to be able to be part of the solution. On November 24th, we chatted to the partnership's director and our friend Alicia Wanless about her work in this space and what can be done to tackle this all-pervasive problem. Alicia researches how people shape and are shaped by a changing information space. She conducts content and network analysis and has developed original models for identifying and analyzing digital propaganda campaigns. So she has plenty of insights on the problem, but also on the solution and how we can move forward. Let's listen to our conversation with Alicia Wanless.
Alicia Wanless, thanks for joining the Diplomatic Community Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Alicia is a friend of the show and someone that we work with rather closely on a number of initiatives, including one that we call the Sphere of Influence that brings together a bunch of different people working on disinformation and misinformation and influence operations to keep the ball rolling on discussions on what's important in the field. And so we're happy to have her on the show today. And in the past on the podcast, I've mentioned our recent working group report. One of the key points that we discussed in the working group meetings was the need for both a clearinghouse of sorts that would take stock of all the individuals, programs, institutions, et cetera, that are working on these issues. And another was the need for some entity to take on the task of convening these different groups to ensure that everyone knew what each other was working on, to find ways to work together, et cetera. Thankfully, Alicia, you are doing both at the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations. Can you tell us a little bit more about the partnership?
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you think so highly of us. The partnership, we are really chipping away at some of these things. There's much work to be done and no single organization can do it all. But our main aim in setting up the partnership was to try to foster a cross-sector, multidisciplinary community that was addressing influence operations. As it stands today, we've got about 28 official partners. They represent industry, academic institutions, think tanks, some civil society, otherwise NGOs, as well as media. And we have three programmatic pillars to pursue our goal. The first is conducting a series of meta-studies, some of which will be released this month, about what is known and being done about influence operations. So this includes things like policy proposals that have been made, or what are the known effects of influence operations, or the interventions platforms have publicly disclosed. So it offers a bit of a clearinghouse, but more so since we coded that data, it offers insights into the overarching field and patterns within it. The second area is convening, and to that end, we've launched an Influence Operations Researchers Guild to foster excellence among the investigative research community, and we host things like the Sphere of Influence with you guys, which is a monthly brainstorm with our community. And then the third area is a wider collaborative research experiment that we're doing in partnership with Princeton's Empirical Studies of Conflict. And what we've been doing is convening academic and industry researchers to design 3 research projects measuring the spread of influence operations across platforms, their effects, and the effectiveness of countermeasures.
You mentioned the Sphere of Influence, and we worked together with you guys on that. And one of the things we talked about in one of our first meetings was, there's all these definitions, or people throw around terms like information operations, influence operations, disinformation, misinformation, and stuff. There's just a lot of different definitions of what that is, and not everybody's on the same page with that. So we looked in the first Sphere of Influence meeting on, what do people that are working in this area or working in this sphere, if you will, it's my bad joke there. But what are they sort of, how do they define influence? And with that in mind, we kind of want to get into sort of like how people conceptualize the information environment and everything. So can you tell us a little bit, you told us a little bit about what PCIO is doing, but tell us a little bit more about your own research and how you're conceptualizing the information environment.
Oh, that's a big question, Kelly.
It is. We only get into big questions here at Diplomatic Community.
So, because there was a lot of things to unpack there beyond my own work. Obviously, the space is fairly nascent. I think what happened was you've got a lot of people coming from a lot of different backgrounds and disciplines, and that's been a bit of a challenge. But it's also been kind of exciting because people like me who are more interested in propaganda from the outset bring more background on political communications and what that might mean, whereas people with computer science backgrounds can take massive amounts of data and make sense of what is increasingly a more complex information environment. But then, one of the few spaces that was actively interested in this back when I started researching it in 2014 was military, right? And they're the ones who have kind of put forward perhaps some of the better conceptualizations around what this is: influence operations, information operations, that kind of concept that brings together a variety of tactics and types of actors who would use it and the messages that they would be putting forward to put a better framing. Again, part of the problem with the definition issue is more so that we have a lot of different specific terms around what is the types of activities undertaken in something like influence operations. So disinformation gets a lot of focus, but it's like one single thing that an actor might use to try to manipulate the information environment. So typically what happens is the majority of focus on this research in the past has been on specific campaigns, how they've been run and who they've been run by. But that really creates a deficit in terms of us understanding the space in which this takes place. So to me, in my research at King's College London for my PhD is much more about trying to understand what the information environment is as a concept and what the conditions within it would be that may be problematic for societies going forward. So I tend to look at the information environment as a much more complex system whereby information is processed, consumed, and shared between entities, including humans, technology, and this is multiple factors, right? So cognitive, technological, biological, and understanding that as a system is really where I'm most interested in. That's not necessarily what the partnership has been focused on per se.
So with that in mind a little bit, we're obviously seeing in the US with the election that we just had that you might have heard about, there was a lot of effort placed on countering foreign influence campaigns, but focusing really on states like Russia, China, Iran, and those kind of actors. But then it seems like those actors haven't been able to have as much of an impact as we saw in the 2016 election. Nevertheless, domestic disinformation, misinformation have flourished recently. So with your research on the information environment in mind, tell us a bit about what you've seen at PCIO during the election and its aftermath over the last few weeks. And are there any conclusions we can draw at this point, do you think, about what we've seen in this election cycle in the US?
So as a person who'd been researching how propaganda has been changing in a digital age, again, since about 2014, it's interesting for me to watch kind of the progression of how this has been talked about, discussed, looked at, covered by the media. And so what I find fascinating is that in an information environment that's so interconnected and complex as ours is in a digital age, right? So technology has essentially changed how communications happen, right? We can reach greater distances, we can obfuscate where it's coming from, all at a time when more and more data is being aggregated, and we have a better idea of what might influence people. I think I would caution that we don't really know much about the impact of influence operations. There has been a lot of speculation about what happened in 2016 and a conflation of evidence of activity with proof of effect. So to that end, I'm not sure that we've really got better measurements in place to know how it's affected this election either. But even in 2016, it was clear to me, and I was doing research on the campaign during the primary election, it was never as simple as a foreign actor coming in and upsetting everyone. Really, the modern information environment is extremely complex, interconnected, and loud. There's a tendency in coverage, research, and policy solutions around influence operations that focuses really on specific tactics or actors. And I think that's a bit of a mistake. It isn't very strategic. For example, there's a lot of information on a lot of focus on disinformation, but it's really just one tactic in influence operations. And if we base all our countermeasures on it, our framework isn't nimble enough to really account for other tactics or unknown threats as they arise. Now, in the context of the last election, there are a few things that stand out as being different from 2016. One, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. So disinformation tends to follow crises because people are seeking answers, any answers, and that makes them a lot more susceptible in periods of uncertainty. The second is the role of politicians in picking up that disinformation and using it for their own influence operations. And that's something that I find really fascinating in terms of how influence operations and the operators behind them behave, especially in this digital age. And if you wanted an example for how messy it gets, how quickly, I would point to the Hunter Biden laptop issue. So as you know, someone had either hacked or faked the contents of that laptop. Some of your former US intel officials say it had hallmarks of a foreign operation. An American media outlet picks that up. New York Post runs with it. Trump and his supporters jump on it to further their cause. Meanwhile, Twitter and Facebook took separate actions to suppress the spread. And as there were doubts to the authenticity, it's unclear if it's a hack, and the Post published private information, but that was enough for some of them to take action on. Now that intervention blows up into a debate among researchers and the platforms and their choices. And then Twitter and Facebook are attacked for bias by Trump supporters, right? Ultimately becoming the target of the influence operation in a way. And so the point here is that when it comes to influence operations, everything's interconnected in the information environment. It might start with a foreign operation, or it might merely be amplified by one, but myriad other actors are also going to jump into it, get entangled with it, and use it. And that seems to happen over and over again. So for me, always that focus of foreign versus domestic was problematic, because what is foreign and domestic in a digital age, essentially, right? It's easy to delineate actors who are sitting in another country and who are pretending to be Americans, great. But what about all the other concepts of citizenship and place where people live in a globalized world, right? Are undocumented citizens in a country able to try to influence the situation where they are to campaign to stay? Is that legitimate? What happens if you have diaspora who in their new country are either campaigning for change where they live now or want to influence the country where they came from? Where are the lines and acceptability around that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and something we talked about in our working group as well. And the report, ultimately the report that came out of that. I mean, our last working group meetings were in March, just before the shutdown, and then another one in April. And at that point, it was becoming kind of more and more apparent, as we had been getting into Democratic primary season and all that kind of stuff, that we were beginning to see a shift in sort of what we had anticipated would be sort of the foreign actors' roles and stuff, with a lot of the sort of co-opting of locals. And there was a lot more sort of domestic misinformation, disinformation that was then just being amplified by outside actors. And it just gets, the waters get muddier and muddier as you sort of move along that line and try to see what's going on. And I think my biggest kind of takeaway as far as the information operations from the foreign influence aspect of all this is just a need to kind of sit back and look at what happened in 2016 versus what happened in 2020. And then how do you, like you said, like, how do you kind of measure this with what we know from 2016 versus where we are now in 2020? So that being said, and you kind of touched on this a little bit in your answer there, but on December 1st, and for today is November 24th, that we are recording this podcast interview, but next week, a week from today, I guess, we are hosting a Carnegie Endowment event with your team at PCIO. And we specifically want to dive into the human element of influence operations and how to tackle this part of the problem to really get at the root of the issue. And so by the human element, we mean sort of how we educate and sensitize the public to problems of misinformation and disinformation, and how do you teach digital literacy and critical thinking skills and that kind of stuff. So in your mind, sort of, if you could give us a little bit of what you think might be some of the topics discussed and a little preview of the event, why is the human element in education and sensitization such an important part of the solution? And how would you like to see journalists, the tech sector, civil society, whomever tackle this problem going forward, especially if legislation is either extremely hard to come by or not possible?
Kelly, did you just ask me how to fix everything?
Yeah.
Yeah, Alicia, you
Okay.
told us to stop admiring the problem. So
yeah, you said you like to dig in and get to the solution. So
that's why I brought experts in.
We're gonna solve the out of this problem.
Okay. Seriously though, in my thesis, I've been trying to find conditions in the information ecosystem that might forecast trouble. So that means using historic examples from every major media epic in history. And what strikes me is how the same problems repeat. Every time a new technology massively changes how we process or consume information, a few problems seem to always follow. One, we have a significant increase in the volume of information that then audiences complain they can't possibly consume or deal with. Then we have a flood. After the flood, there tends to be information pollution, including disinformation, that gets pushed by those who are seeking power, those proselytizing their beliefs, and those seeking to turn a profit to capitalize on the situation. And in all of this, there's one common denominator. It doesn't matter what technology you have, there are humans. They're not only repeatedly susceptible to things like disinformation, but they also want to consume it. In the long run, that's the one thing we have and should focus on, preparing people to live in their current information environment. And that's why, to me, this is so fundamentally important, because technologies are always going to change. Now, were I to have a magic wand to fix all the problems, I'm not sure I would tackle it sector by sector. But the first thing that I think we need very immediately is a better framing of this issue. Like, what does it mean? And what I mean by framing, I think almost a framework for looking at it, such that we're not overly focused on specific tactics or actors, but we have a conceptualization for whatever influence operations is that can be applied to future unknown threats. And right now, we don't have that. We're building policy based on the latest action or the latest type of content that we disagree with. We're also very reactive and sometimes a little bit hysterical, as if we've never, as humanity, faced this problem before. But we have, and we will again. And it may just be bigger the next time, but it doesn't mean that this isn't something that we've continuously been plagued with.
One thing that people tend to forget is that the means may be different. You know, they might be the propaganda, the influence operation, the disinformation, misinformation, whatever you want to call it, might be coming through Facebook or Twitter now, but it's the same issue and tactics and techniques and things that have been going on for decades and centuries. And you know, it's as old as, like you said, it's as old as human beings. And a quick follow-on on that, I'd be interested as a historian to know what are the technological changes you look at in your research? You talked about how there's like these flood of new technologies creates this new atmosphere around these issues. Is it like, you know, the telegraph and then the radio and then the TV? Like, what are you looking at?
So in my vain attempts to try to develop a theory of the information environment, I actually have one from the oral to the written era. So that's the Peloponnesian War. Then after print, I have the English Civil War, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, because it's not isolated just to England. In terms of, then I broke up the next age into two. So for telegraph and train, which fundamentally change it, I have the American Civil War. And then after television comes into play for the electronic age, I have Vietnam War. And then finally, I'm wrapping that up with Donbass and the Ukraine conflict.
That's very slackerish of you. I mean, that's only 2,500 years you're looking at. So I think you need to step up your game a little bit. But
what can I say? My supervisors love me. They thought that this would be a really good idea.
Anyways, that's daunting, but fascinating at the same time. So I wish you well in finishing that up. Thank you so much for taking some time today to chat with us about influence operations and you know, where we are, where we might be going, and the main aspects of this that we need to tackle. And I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm sure this won't be our last conversation on this topic.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Follow us on Twitter at GU Diplomacy, and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu.